All right, Craig. Welcome everyone, and would like to welcome you again, Craig, to this next session as we continue with the Book of Mark. Thanks for the way that you've led us through this semester, and we're looking forward to this next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dwight. It's great to be with you all, and yes, we are going. This is just another picture from Todd Bolin. I have a bunch of pictures from Todd Bolin, but this is just a model of the palatial mansion from Jerusalem that's been excavated. We don't know that this actually was the high priest's mansion, but it may have been. If it wasn't this one, it was something that was similarly quite large. And so Jesus is in one court of the high priest's house, answering to the Sanhedrin, or those members of the Sanhedrin who were gathered. I kind of doubt that the high priest invited some people, like maybe Joseph of Arimathea wasn't invited, whatever, but because it wasn't really an official meeting, but we'll talk about that in a few moments. But in another place, in the outer court, Peter is in the midst of denying Jesus at this point. So the Sanhedrin here violates Pharisaic legal principles. We don't actually know how many of the Pharisees were invited, because the high priest and his peers were mostly Sadducees, the aristocratic priests. And they may not have wanted too many of the Pharisees present, because the Pharisees tended to be sticklers for doing things legally. And all of our sources from the period show that the high priests were fairly corrupt. So, you know, whether you're looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls or Josephus or the Gospels, yeah, the high priests were, they were ripping people off, including lower level priests and so on. So we don't really expect that they're going to follow all the rules. But here were the things that were considered ethical by what became mainstream Judaism, like following the more Pharisaic tradition into the later rabbis and so on. And these would be considered, for the most part, standard legal ethics throughout the Roman Empire. So in other words, when they were broken, these would be considered breaches of protocol. Well, the Sanhedrin here violates these principles. You weren't supposed to meet on a holy day. You weren't supposed to hold a trial by night. You weren't supposed to hold a trial in the high priest's home. And you weren't supposed to have it with lack of advance notice, which means nobody who disagrees with you can show up because nobody told them you were meeting. And most certainly, everybody would agree, although it was commonly practiced, that false witnesses were illegal, immoral, unethical. In this scene, Jesus is going to let out the messianic secret. The charge against him about the temple didn't work. So they ask him something else, hoping that he will admit that he's the Messiah, and then they can hand him over to the Romans, because of course the Messiah was the king of Israel. And if you have any king besides Caesar, that's grounds for execution by treason. But they start with the temple charge. We heard him say, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another temple not made with hands." Where did they get this idea that Jesus would have said something like that? Well, back in chapter 11, he overturns the tables in the temple, but he's actually purifying the existing temple. He's trying to turn it around, bring it to repentance. He says, quoting the Old Testament, that this was meant to be a house of prayer for all the nations. They had turned it into a robber's den, but he wasn't saying he wanted to destroy it. He was wanting to purify it back to its original purpose. But it didn't happen. The leaders wouldn't let go of it. And so chapter 13 and verse 2, he says, "Not one stone will be left upon another." Well, most of chapter 13, Jesus is speaking privately. He's not even speaking to all 12 of his disciples. He's speaking with 4 of his disciples, Andrew and Simon, and James and John, two of the sets of brothers in that chapter, privately on the Mount of Olives. However, it's when they're leaving the temple that his disciples are saying to him, hey, look at all these massive buildings in this temple. And Jesus there says, not one stone will be left on another. So somebody may have overheard it. It's also possible that when Judas betrays Jesus earlier in chapter 14, he leaks some of the information about Jesus, that, yeah, Jesus' inner circle, they think he's the Son of God, and Jesus' inner circle, you know, James and John or Peter, loudmouth Peter, or somebody they were telling us that Jesus was saying that this temple is going to be destroyed. In any case, Jesus did say something like this that we read about in another gospel: destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. But does Jesus say, I will destroy this temple? Or does he tell them, if you destroy this temple, I'll raise it up? And which temple is he talking about? Well, Mark calls this false testimony. Why is it false? Well, it's false especially because they quote Jesus as saying, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands. Jesus didn't say any such thing. He wasn't trying to destroy the old one. But that would be a great charge to use against him if he did say it, because, you know, plotting to overthrow the temple is a pretty serious charge. Romans allowed one capital sentence for Jewish people. It was automatic. If somebody desecrated the temple, that was grounds for execution. But this is a false charge. Jesus wasn't trying to desecrate it. He was saying they were the ones desecrating it. You've turned it into a robber's den. False accusations, though, were pretty common in antiquity. Obviously, they were illegal, but prosecutors could get away with them. They weren't false witnesses. They weren't under oath. So in the 2nd century, Marcus Aurelius, who later becomes emperor, but right now he's a son of an emperor, he writes to the prosecutor of a certain case, who's his old teacher, Fronto, and says, you know, this person that you're prosecuting, he's a good friend of mine, so I hope you go easy on him. And Fronto writes back and says, well, okay, my job as prosecutor, I don't want to look like a bad orator. I've got to try to convict him. But, you know, out of respect for you, I won't add any extra charges against him. I won't make up anything, accusations against him. The implication, of course, is that were he not friends with the emperor's son, he would make up charges against him. So, and there were actually some rhetorical handbooks. These were what were used to train people so they could speak in court or speak in the Senate or whatever. There was a rhetorical handbook from an earlier period, Rhetorica ad Alexandrum, that said, it actually gave advice on how to get away with having false witnesses. So you could not be caught perjuring yourself, how to word things in a certain way. I guess we've had some of those in recent history. What was that? I did smoke, but I didn't inhale, or something like that. But anyway, but what would be the punishment for false accusers in a capital case, that is a case with a death sentence? Both in Jewish law, Deuteronomy 17 and 19, and in Roman law, the penalty for false witnesses in a capital case would be death. Well, here the witnesses are found to be false, but there's no penalty given to them. This is a fake trial, so to speak. Here's the irony. Killing Jesus will precipitate the Jerusalem temple's destruction. And you see a foretaste of that when Jesus dies. The veil of the temple is rent in chapter 15 and verse 38. But Jesus is not the one destroying the temple, neither the temple of his body nor the Jerusalem temple. But by destroying the temple of Jesus' body, those who have handed him over to death are the ones sealing the fate of the temple that they pretend to protect, which they're actually desecrating, according to Jesus. But even on this point, Mark says, their testimony didn't agree. So Pharisees were really big on cross-examination. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses. That was already in the Torah, in Numbers, in Deuteronomy. And there was a long tradition of practicing this, cross-examination, to make sure the witnesses agree. Otherwise, the case had to be thrown out. So there was a story told. It's not in our Protestant Bibles. It's in the Apocrypha, but a story told of the prophet Daniel when he was young. Susanna was a righteous woman, but she was, like Joseph was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. Well, she was falsely accused by a couple suitors because she wouldn't sleep with them. And so they raised a charge against her, and they said that she did this bad thing. And so he said, let me cross-examine them privately. Susanna was going to be executed. He said, no, let me cross-examine them. He cross-examines them. They both said she did this deed under a tree. So he says, what kind of tree was it? Oh, they hadn't figured that out in advance. So their stories didn't agree. So they got killed rather than Susanna. Here, whoever it is who does the cross-examination does their job well. They're not expecting these to be false witnesses. But, for the high priest, this is mainly a formality. Well, the false witnesses don't work. Let's go on to the next point. When witnesses disagree, the case should be thrown out. The false witnesses should be executed, which they're actually not going to execute him, but at least they could have, punished him somehow. But, he's saying, well, don't you have an answer to these charges? Oh, they're false charges, obviously. Jesus remained silent. This is a kangaroo court. Like some Maccabean martyrs, when they were going to be martyred for their faithfulness to the Torah, Jesus stays faithful, and he doesn't answer. Well, they would see that as arrogant, but he offers no defense, like Isaiah talked about in Isaiah 53, like a lamb that's led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. The high priest intervenes in the process. It says arising, getting up, just like the witnesses did a few verses earlier in verse 57. The temple charge won't work, so he goes for another one. He goes for Jesus' identity. Jesus Christ is Son of God. Mark tells us that in his opening verse. Here's the irony. He's going to be convicted based on confessing the same identity that his Father, God, had affirmed for him in chapter 1 and verse 11, and again in chapter 9 and verse 7. The messianic mystery, the messianic secret, Jesus' secret identity is now ready to be revealed, because beforehand he's postponing his execution, but the time has now come. His hour has come. And because the rulers will reject him, his kingship had to culminate in the cross. Now, in New Testament theology, this is good news for Gentiles, because that gives Gentiles a right to have access to the covenant. You see that in Acts. You see it very explicitly in Romans chapter 11. But in any case, the high priest asks Jesus his identity. So, you're the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One. Now, in Greek, you know it's a question, and you can make it into a question by, raising your voice at the end like you do with a question. But in Greek, the way it's stated, it could be read as a statement rather than a question. And so, again, you have Markan irony here. The high priest, rather than Jesus, initially breaks the secret, confessing the Christ, the Son of God. Where did the high priest get the idea that Jesus thought he was the Christ, the Son of God? Well, Judas may have betrayed something, but also the vineyard, the parable of the vineyard that Jesus gave publicly in chapter 12, that the chief priests knew was spoken against them when he speaks of the cornerstone that the builders rejected. in chapter 12, verses 6 through 8, the vineyard tenants who, are the people running the temple establishment, they kill God's beloved son. And from the context, it kind of looks like Jesus is talking about himself. So he's coming out of the closet, so to speak, of his secret identity already in chapter 12, but subtly. But they can see where it's going. They just need to hear it from his own mouth. So because they didn't have witnesses present, Judas wasn't present as one of the witnesses. So Jesus answers in verse 62. He answers, I am. And in this case, I included the Greek there so you can see it's ego and me. It functions in some other places of the divine name, probably even back in Mark chapter 6, where Jesus is walking on water and is about to pass him by, and he says, I am, or I am he, but in Greek it was just I am. So he says, I am, which could be the divine name, but it's still not clear if it's just by itself. It could be, I am the Son of God you were talking about, but genetically he's God. And so he says, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. And here he weaves together two texts from the Old Testament, Daniel 7:13, which we've looked at before, and especially in Mark 13:26, I think it was, where he talks about he's going to come in the clouds as the Son of Man. That's a clear reference to Daniel chapter 7. So, earlier when Jesus says he's the Son of Man, or he talks about the Son of Man, they may be like, okay, is he talking about Daniel 7, or is he just talking about a human being? What does he mean? At this point, he's clear. It's a clear reference to Daniel 7, because that's the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power. And the Son of Man who comes in the clouds with power in Daniel 7 receives worship. So he looks kind of divine, especially because in contrast to the four beasts who represent four empires, four kings, he represents the kingdom of God. That's why he's portrayed as a man rather than a beast. He's in the image of God. So Jesus says, I'm the Son of Man, the ideal human, the God-man, so to speak. Seated at the right hand of power. Well, they've already heard what he said publicly in the temple in chapter 12, where he quoted from Psalm 110, verse 1, the Lord said to my Lord, and Jesus says, the one who's coming is not just David's son, he's David's Lord, something greater than David's son. Well, power was a circumlocution for God, a polite way of speaking of God's name. And so, well, there you go. And actually, according to later rabbis, although I doubt that the Sanhedrin would be so picky, but according to later rabbis, you actually had to pronounce the divine name to be convicted of blasphemy. So if they really wanted to be technical here, they could say where he says, I am, that he's pronouncing the divine name. But in any case, it's clear what he means by Son of Man, and it's clear that he means that he's more than even an earthly Messiah, something greater than that. Now, again, in Daniel chapter 11, you look in the context, these four beasts, they oppress God's people. Well, when the Son of Man comes, God's people are exalted, God's people who first suffered under the evil empire. And since he represents both God and the saints of the Most High, it makes sense that the Son of Man also suffers before he's exalted. And that's what's about to happen. So the high priest tears his clothes, which is what you're supposed to do if you hear blasphemy. The high priest considers it blasphemy that Jesus is God's son and the Son of Man. And we've been kind of prepared for this ever since chapter 2 and verse 7, where Jesus' critics, some scribes, said, why does this fellow speak this way? It's blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Well, now Jesus has made another exalted claim. And now they say, okay, we got him. This is explicit. And yet, according to Mark chapter 3, the real blasphemy is rejecting even the Spirit's clear evidence for Jesus. It was Jesus' accusers, rather than Jesus himself, who were risking blasphemy. Now, when the high priest tears his clothes, Medine, don't worry, I'm not going to actually literally do that. But when he tears his clothes, we've seen images of tearing before in this gospel. Remember the new wine or the new cloth, tearing the old wineskin or the old fabric back in I believe it's 21 and 22. And soon in 1538, the curtain for the temple as a whole will tear. The old system cannot contain God's new work. It's going to go so far beyond everybody's expectations and the systems that have been built around those. So in 1464, they all condemned him to death. And when it says all the Sanhedrin, means all the Sanhedrin is gathered. This wasn't their normal meeting place or time. And again, probably the high priest only invited the people he thought would agree with him. But remember Mark 3, Jesus challenged his critics. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? And he was there doing good and doing something that ultimately restores life. But his critics in verse 6 went out immediately and conspired with the Herodians, the government people in Galilee, how to destroy him. So the irony is, we put to death the Prince of Life. And then people mock him. Again, this is ironic because he's the very person that they mock him for claiming to be. King of the Jews, that's what the soldiers will later say, but here, a prophet for God. So they say to him, prophesy, they blindfold him, prophesy to us. Who struck you? And the irony is that Jesus' prophecy about Peter is being fulfilled while the vineyard tenants are mocking Jesus as a false prophet. Now, as far as abuse of prisoners, whether here or later we're going to see with Roman soldiers, that's common practice in many places. In countries like ours, it's illegal, but it still happens. You can recall a US prison in Iraq. Some of you can recall that, maybe, a couple decades ago, the early 20th century. At least those of us who are old can maybe recall that. And some of those people who were doing it had been working in prisons in the US before. I suspect that they didn't just start treating people that way when they got to Iraq. But in any case, that's not to say everybody in prisons does that, but we do have some credible reports of that happening, including in US prisons. So they hand him over to Pilate. And here are just a couple coins of Pilate, just so you see he was a real person. Because some people say, well, Roman literature doesn't talk much about Jesus. It only talks a little bit about Jesus. It doesn't talk at all about Pilate, except in one reference to Jesus. But we know that Pilate existed because he had coins and he's mentioned in the Jewish sources. But, people, they get as skeptical as they think they can get away with. But anyway, the only time Pilate is ever mentioned is actually in Tacitus's Annals. Was it 14, 15? Anyway, somewhere in Tacitus's Annals, when he talks about Jesus being executed, he says he was executed under Pontius Pilate. That's the only place in Roman historians that even mention Pilate, because Pilate wasn't a big deal in Rome. But anyway, political expediency versus justice. That fits history. That's the way things were typically done back then. Christians wouldn't have invented a Roman execution or King of the Jews charge, because that made them look like they were treasonous. I mean, that's like, unless you're trying to commit suicide, you don't make up stuff like that. it also fits, the accusers would speak first in any hearing. By the way, these hearings, they go early in the morning. So maybe it's sunrise. That's when Roman courts would open. That's when Roman patrons were available for their clients. Sunrise, I'm a night person. It's hard for me to stay up that late, until sunrise. But anyway, the accusers speak first. The governor questions. He has an advisory council called the Concilium. Pilate here acts pretty much like we know from the Jewish sources of Josephus and Philo that Pilate did act. He executed people on whim sometimes, but at the same time, he was really totally dependent on Rome's favor. Plus, he wasn't of the normal social class to be a governor. He got in probably because of favor from the Praetorian prefect who was close to the emperor. So he's politically vulnerable. So he has to watch his step a little bit. And we know from other events surrounding Pilate, according to Josephus, that Pilate really, sometimes he almost enjoyed antagonizing the Jewish leaders, but he'd end up giving in because they could threaten to report him to the emperor and make trouble for him. So finally he gives in. Now, in Roman law, a defendant who refuses to defend himself had to be condemned. Jesus refuses to condemn himself. Jesus, yes, others handed him over to the cross, but Jesus also is willingly being like a sheep led to the slaughter. But Pilate tries to use the crowds to relieve himself of responsibility. He says, okay, I don't think this guy's guilty. And the Gospel of John actually gives us an idea about why he may not have thought Jesus was guilty. He's like, well, so you're a king? Jesus says, if I were a king like you're talking about, my servants would fight, so I wouldn't be delivered over to these Jewish authorities. But actually, my kingdom is about truth. And Pilate's like, oh yeah, we've heard of these people. These are sages. These are like harmless philosophers. They're just like professors, they're so impractical. So he's not really dangerous. I'm trying to, no, that's not working. Trying to adjust the light on my screen. But anyway, so he thinks, okay, well, I don't want to violate good Roman procedure if I don't have to. I think the guy's innocent. I really don't care what the chief priests think. But on the other hand, I don't need more trouble with them. So he finds a way around it. He says, well, the crowds want him to release somebody. He says, hey, tell you what, I can release for you your king. The crowds, he's already heard about this. The crowds supposedly love Jesus. Those are mainly the Galilean crowds. But, he says, look, yeah, okay, tell you what, how about I release Jesus for you? He can be the one I release this year. But he underestimates the chief priest's influence. In ancient literature, crowds are often depicted as fickle, easily swayed by leaders, whether populist leaders or officials. And that's really true today too, when you think about it. I mean, you've got right-wing media, you've got left-wing media, people who listen only to their preferred media outlet tend to be pretty polarized because they tend to follow whatever they hear. And you have massive political shifts where somebody will vote for a president, they'll really like the president. Later on, some of the same people want to vote the person out of office. It comes and goes in waves. This is not commenting on either of our political parties in the US. It's just to talk about people change their minds a lot, and especially when they're influenced by influential voices. Now, the Galileans loved Jesus. The Galilean crowds loved Jesus all the way through the Gospel of Mark. But who is showing up at Pilate's court? Probably local Judean crowds, especially, probably mainly Jerusalemites, people who aren't as familiar with Jesus. So again, historically, this is not talking about the whole of the Jewish people. Most of the Jewish people loved Jesus, but the leaders, especially the corrupt leaders, they had a good bit of influence. And so we read that they handed Jesus over to Pilate, and Pilate handed him over to be crucified. You have a chain of guilt with this handing over language. Same Greek word in all these cases. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they in turn will hand them over to the Gentiles. Well, before that, we find out, or actually, the handing over to the chief priests, that's Judas Iscariot, 14:10. And it's also interesting how Jesus describes it. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. But then they bind to Jesus, they hand him over to Pilate. And finally, in 15:15, Pilate hands him over to be crucified. We also have the character Barabbas here early in chapter 15. Urged by the aristocratic priests, the people ask for Barabbas. And here we have another irony. Jesus, Son of God, giver of life, dies so that a murderer, Barabbas, whose name means son of the Father. Mark doesn't have to translate that for us because he's already spoken about Bartimaeus, meaning son of Timaeus, back in chapter 10. And we already know because he translated Jesus' prayer, Abba, Father. Somebody who's been paying good attention to Mark so far knows what Bar means and knows what Abba means. And they know that Barabbas is a nickname for son of the Father. Jesus dies so that a fake son of the Father can go free. But in principle, Barabbas is us, because Jesus died for our sins so we could go free. Passover was a festival of liberation. It was celebrating how God delivered his people from captivity, from bondage. And it was about a Passover lamb and Egypt's firstborn who died so that Israel, God's firstborn, in the language of Exodus, could go free. Jesus is our Passover lamb. Well, now Rome's soldiers torture Jesus. If Pilate followed the usual formula, and he may not have, but often Roman governors would say something like this: ibis in cucem. My first century Latin lacks precision, so please forgive me if I didn't pronounce it in the correct first century manner. But anyway, you will mount the cross. That would be the verdict. Now, this takes place in the courtyard of the palace. That's stated in Mark. Well, where did the Roman governor stay? It used to be thought by a lot of tradition that he stayed in the Fortress Antonia, where the Roman cohort was stationed. And so that's why you have the Via Dolorosa leading out from there. But actually, you read Josephus and other things, he just stayed probably in the best palace in town. He stayed in Herod the Great's old palace in Upper City, Jerusalem. And he ordered Jesus scourged. Now, Herod's palace takes up, as you can see, a large part of Jerusalem. And here is on the model of Jerusalem, just the narrowest part of the palace. But Phasial, Hippicus, and Mariamne, the other towers were associated with the palace too. So, this large courtyard out here, he could be using that as well when he's speaking to the crowds. In terms of when the Roman cohort gathers, they're probably in this area. So again, you can see it on these models. And this is actually somebody pretending to be the emperor, but I didn't have a good picture of somebody pretending to be the Roman governor. So actually, whether I was a governor or an emperor, if I had a Roman guard standing near me holding a sword like that, I would want to be on good terms with my guards. Well, the way the Romans executed people, abuse of prisoners was common. We read about it often in ancient literature. And when they would hail Caesar, it would be Ave Caesar, hail King. And so they're making fun of Jesus this way. Of course, the irony is this really is the king. They take probably a bamboo cane that's used for military floggings. They use that as a scepter, maybe an acanthus shrub, which doesn't look like the one I have a picture of here, but I don't have a good picture of acanthus with thorns on it. But they probably used an acanthus shrub or some other thing. There was a lot of thorns all over the place. So, but you know, to make it look like a ruler's crown, the thorns would be especially pointing outward. But if you've ever tried to weave a crown of thorns, which you probably haven't because you probably cut yourself, but if you try to do that, you realize the thorns don't just point one way. So even though they're doing it to imitate a crown of thorn, you know, a crown with spokes pointing outward, like Hellenistic rulers had, some of the thorns are going to be pointing inward, and scalps bleed particularly profusely. They probably used a faded soldier's cloak as a purple royal robe. Some gospels describe it as purple, some describe it as crimson, as red. Different languages, they divide the colors in the electromagnetic spectrum differently. So for example, in Greek, we read about the chloros hippos in Revelation 6, the green horse, but it just means a pale horse. In Greek, the color goes from green to the color of a pale corpse. Well, in this case, the red, you know, if it's faded, the red and the purple, they do the job. Here are murex shells. They would crush these. They'd crush the shellfish inside of them and squeeze out their juice. And if you squeezed out a few thousand of them, you'd have enough to make a purple robe. Well, they're not going to actually make a purple robe for Jesus. They're probably going to use a faded red soldier's cloak, but they're pretending. In terms of scourgings, Jewish synagogue beatings, they were limited to 39 lashes. We know that from this period, and actually, you know, goes back to Deuteronomy, no more than 40 lashes. By this period, they said 39 is max. Romans weren't limited like that. They would use a flagellum, which could have broken metal and bone or glass woven into the tips. And the soldier could beat the condemned person as hard as he could until he got tired of doing it. Sometimes the person's bones showed. We know that for another person Josephus talks about. Sometimes they died from the flogging, but normally a person would be flogged before they would be crucified. This is just to give you a sense of how heavy a cross would be. Now, probably Jesus only carried the horizontal beam of the cross, not the vertical beam, so it wouldn't be as heavy as this, but it's still quite weighty and still hard to carry, especially if you've just been flogged. If you've lost a lot of blood, you're going to be weak. So Jesus doesn't carry it the whole way. We know that the Romans draft, normally they would have the condemned person carry their own cross. So what we see in John is the norm. But if they couldn't carry it, well, Romans could draft somebody else to do it. They don't want to carry it themselves. And so they draft Simon of Cyrene. Now, what did Jesus told his disciples? If you really want to be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. Well, all these disciples have said, we'll follow you no matter what. We'll follow you to the end. They abandoned him and fled back in 1450 through 52. Peter, who was insistent, he followed him even in the high priest's palace. But this time with the cross, all of his disciples had left him. And so they don't pick up his cross. Romans have to draft a bystander, Simon of Cyrene, to do what none of his disciples were willing to do for him. And so here is the traditional location of the crucifixion and the garden tomb on the Jerusalem model. Here's some giants in the background, but no, it's a model. Golgotha and the Holy Sepulchre are probably the right site, or very close to the right site. Jesus was executed and buried around the year 30. And that had to be done outside the city walls. But the site that is preserved is inside the city walls. Well, why would people make up that site? Well, chances are they didn't make up that site, but it goes back before the city was expanded, because Herod Agrippa I, somewhere between probably 11 and 14 years after Jesus, 11 and 13 years after Jesus' crucifixion, expanded the city walls outside of Golgotha. But before then, it was outside the city walls. It was outside the earlier city walls. So the site of Golgotha and the Catholic Orthodox Holy Sepulchre goes back to within probably 10 to 13 years of Jesus' death and crucifixion. So we have, you talk about, well, people can forget things. Yeah, probably within the span of that length of time. I mean, the women follow to the cross, they follow to the tomb. Here's the rock outcropping where the tradition is that that's the original site. Now, if you've been on a tour to Gordon's Calvary, that's been the Protestant site for like over 100 years. I hate to let you know this, but that is not the right site. That was made up in the 1800s by General Gordon, using typology and using what he thought was the shape of a skull. It really was not, it's not based on anything. So, but at least it keeps the Catholic and Orthodox site from getting too crowded. Yeah, he based it on, he says, oh, this area, it looks like a skull, it must be it. Crucifixion, sometimes they would nail through the ankles, as they did in Jesus' case. Some people think they nailed him like this. Jesus' hands were also nailed. And you can imagine how hard this would be. And these are fairly massive spikes. So, but they couldn't do it here because your hand would rip open and you'd fall off. Well, maybe not, since they probably also have you tied. But if they probably nailed him somewhere through here to hold him onto the cross. And next week we will pick up with describing Jesus' crucifixion, and we might get to the resurrection next week as well. But this is what Jesus did for us. For his own followers, who when push came to shove, didn't follow him all the way to the cross, but he went and gave himself for us. Such love, such wonderful love. Dwight, back to you.
Thanks again, Craig.
Trying to get out of.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah. I was just trying to get out of screen share. Yep. Thank you.
All right. It's open for questions. I think there's a question in the chat. Maybe we'll go right to that. And if there are any other people with questions, please, you can put them up in the chat. So remembering a teaching from a long time ago that discussed the scapegoat and referenced Jesus being led outside the city gate. I can't remember, but maybe you can clear it up. Where there are 2 goats and one was a sacrifice and one set free. That's the scapegoat. And in light of Barabbas.
Yeah, I don't know if we should see Barabbas as a scapegoat per se, but yeah, that's true. One was sacrificed and one was set free, although the setting free was to carry the sins away out into the wilderness. So it wasn't like there wasn't a sacrificial element with that as well. But the outside the city gate, yeah, Hebrews 13 talks about it, and that's just the way things were done. And burials were supposed to be outside the city as well. that was certainly Jewish custom, but that was a custom in most places as well.
You know, as you were talking about the cross and what, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit more about it next week, but you know, when the Lord says, take up your cross daily, I don't know, can you maybe unpack some of what you think that actually would have meant in that, the depth of that? I mean, what does taking up our cross daily really mean?
Taking up the cross means being ready to follow Jesus to the death.
Mm-hmm.
Taking it up daily, I think that's Luke 9:23 or something, where he adds the daily. Actually, probably Jesus probably actually put it that way too. It may not just be Luke's application, because you have Paul talking about, I protest, I die daily, probably alluding to the same saying. We don't get the privilege of martyrdom every day. Actually, you normally get the privilege of martyrdom only once, but we do get the privilege of living like our own lives are forfeit, that they belong completely to Christ. Mm-hmm. And so every day we devote everything to Jesus, as if, you know, Lord, I give my life to you. It's as a living sacrifice. So they may not be pounding the nails in my hands, thank God. I don't like pain. But whatever I have to do to serve Jesus' purposes, I'll do that. Now, that doesn't mean neglecting my health. If by being healthy, I can have more days to serve him. You know, I want to be a good steward of the resources he's given me, but I'm preserving my health for the sake of, for the sake of sacrificing for his kingdom. There is also something I learned from some medieval monks where they talked about loving ourselves also for God's sake, because we're objects of his love. So he does want us to take care of ourselves because he loves us. So there is that as well. It's not a masochism, but yeah, being totally sold out to Jesus, we can live like we're taking up the cross every day. And then if push comes to shove, and it is time for martyrdom, literally, hopefully we'll do better than our predecessors did the first time around.
Okay. Another question there. You mentioned reference in the Dead Sea Scrolls to corruption of high priests. I thought more about them mainly being Old Testament. Was there a lot of other information?
Yes. Yeah, in fact, in my Dead Sea Scrolls course during my PhD, we were translating a lot of the Hebrew scrolls, but we didn't translate the Hebrew Bible scrolls from there, like the Isaiah scroll. We were mainly translating, or maybe entirely translating, some of the what are sometimes called the sectarian documents. So this talked about, you know, the rules of how they made their community work, and but in the midst of that, especially in a commentary on Habakkuk, they talk about the wicked priest and how the high priesthood chased the teacher of righteousness, their founder, chased him out of Jerusalem and just was abusing his authority. So it's actually dealing with a somewhat earlier period. But then you also have Josephus talking about the high priests who were stealing the tithes that belonged to the lower priests and would use violence. And sometimes they'd commission hits on people, you know, to have them killed. In fact, a few of them tried to get Josephus killed, which he didn't appreciate. I mean, he liked the high priests better than the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls did, but he didn't appreciate them trying to get him killed. And then the Pharisees, their views, their traditions tend to be preserved in the early layers of rabbinic literature, and they don't like the Sadducean high priests either. And they talk about the corruption. They talk about, they name some of them for what they did when they were ripping people off and beating people and threatening people and so on. And they point out, as Josephus points out, that the Pharisees were more popular with the people in this period. A lot of anti-incumbency sentiment. So they really didn't like the Sadducees so much. But the Pharisees held the more popular views like resurrection of the dead and so on. The Sadducees didn't. The Sadducees, the priestly aristocrats, mostly they were from the really wealthy aristocratic families. There were some wealthy Pharisees too, but the Sadducees who ran the high priesthood, because it kept going back and forth between basically two families. The family of Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, 5 of his sons became high priests after him. And in another priestly family, they basically had the high priesthood all wrapped up to themselves. And yeah, all the sources we have speak of them as corrupt. Now, the Sadducees, we don't have their records. They didn't tell us what they thought about themselves, but there may be some reasons why their sources weren't preserved. I wonder why. Probably nobody liked them, but anyway.
Right, okay, great, thanks. Yeah, sorry, it looks like you've got the sun going right into your face, into your eyes there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
if it looks like I'm being transfigured like Stephen was as he was before the Sanhedrin, that's a good thing, but I know it doesn't probably look very pleasant. But happily, I think the screen is mainly on Dwight right now, so that's good.
Okay, yeah. Maybe just one quick question. It's something that I thought about just now. The demographics of there's the Romans. I mean, you pick up the Romans, you pick up the Pharisees, you pick up Simon of Cyrene, and so on. Do you have an idea of what the demographics would have been like? The Roman population, what would it be like? What would be the Middle Eastern kind of Cyrene, African, and so forth? Any idea?
Sure. Jerusalem was a large enough city that it was, well, it wasn't as, a place like Antioch, now that was cosmopolitan, Syrian Antioch. Jerusalem wouldn't have been as cosmopolitan as, say, Caesarea Maritima on the Judean coast. That's where the Roman governor spent most of the time. He would come to Jerusalem just for crowd control during festivals. Mm-hmm. But Jerusalem would have been mainly Jewish in religion. The population may have swelled something like 5 times over during major pilgrimage festivals like Passover. So Josephus's numbers are inflated, but probably the normal population was around 80,000, which is half a century ago, they were estimating like 25,000, but today the estimates are closer to 80,000. But swelled with these pilgrims from around the especially the Eastern Roman Empire, but the whole Roman Empire, and also from Parthia to the east, to the old Persian Empire. Mm-hmm. It may have been like 5 times over. So you'd have people from a lot of different places. You also had a lot of diaspora Jews who would settle there during, especially to retire there if they could. Mm-hmm. So there were a number of diaspora Jews from different places. Those would include places like Alexandria, which the Greeks there spoke of it as Alexandria near Egypt because they were anti-Egyptian bigots. But Alexandria was maybe 1/3 Greek, 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Egyptian in terms of ethnicity. Cyrene, where Simon was from, was about something like that, 1/3 Greek or more, 1/3 North African or more, and then maybe 1/4 Jewish, something like that. Shimon Applebaum did a whole monograph on that, just from the inscriptions we have. And and so on that tell us about the people who lived there. Now, that doesn't tell us Simon's ethnicity because we don't know, he could have been from a North African background and been a convert. He could have been from a Greek background and been a convert. Simon is actually a Greek name, but because it was so close to Simeon, the patriarchal name, and was used by one of the Maccabees, it had become the most popular Jewish name in Judea and Galilee. And it was also very popular in Alexandria and elsewhere for Jews, even though it was originally a Greek name. So as far as the Rome, so we don't know what his ethnic background was, but presumably he's in Jerusalem because he's Jewish. He settled there as a diaspora Jew, or he's a pilgrim for the festival, where it says he's coming in from the field. He wasn't working the field, not on Passover. So he's probably coming in from the field because he spent the night on the Mount of Olives or spent the night in the field or something like that. There wasn't enough room in Jerusalem for everybody to spend the night there after the meal. So some of them would go out to dwellings outside. And then as far as the Romans, you had normally a Roman cohort stationed in the Fortress Antonia on the Temple Mount. And they didn't have to stay there all the time. I mean, they could go out, but they had their own pool. They had their own residences there. There would be extra troops who would probably come with Pilate in the Herod's palace for the festivals. However, in both cases, whether it's the normal cohort or the beefed up cohort during festivals, most of these were auxiliary troops. And even for the legions in this period in the East, most of them were not recruited from Italy. So most of them would have been Syrian. So, when they make fun of Jesus, King of the Jews, probably fits their typical anti-Jewish attitudes, and there were anti-Syrian attitudes among the Jews. There was a lot of ethnic strife that eventually spilled over into a major war. So there were some different ethnicities in Jerusalem, but especially we're thinking most of the people in Jerusalem at this time would have been ethnically Jewish, or, well, they would have been religiously Jewish, whatever they were ethnically, or at least sympathizers with Jewish faith, and that's why they were in this capital. But you'd also have merchants from other places who'd come there to sell from further to the east or elsewhere. Of course, we have the African court official who's coming in Acts chapter 8 in verse 27, and he is definitely, the queen's title there is the Kandaka, so we know that this was the kingdom of Meroe, which existed from around 750 BC. And he is, so he's from a Nubian kingdom, definitely Black African kingdom. And so people like that could also come from afar, who were sympathizers with Jewish faith in the one true God.
Thank you. Very useful. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Okay, there's one more comment there but about the Sadducees, that they're sad, you see. I think let's end with that.
They don't believe in the resurrection, they're sad, you see, but Pharisees are fair, you see.
Oh,
in the farmers, I guess they were pharmacy? Sorry, no, never mind.
Okay. We're done. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, Greg.
Oh.
Oh, bless you, man. All right. Well,